All right. So, as Michael mentioned, my name is Columbus Batiste, and it's a pleasure to be here. My journey actually began many years ago, and I'll tell you when I left training and started my practice, it was an exciting period of time, and I'll never forget that. Most recently, someone mentioned to me, they said, "Man, I remember you when you first started. You were all about procedures and saying, listen, we need to do the way to cure cardiovascular disease is through more procedures." And colleagues of mine just kind of chuckled when he said this because they're like, that's not really who he is anymore. And my journey kind of began and watching my parents, my dad kind of worked hard to kind of put us through school. My parents did, and so forth. So much so, I remember, and he was a professional. He was educated. I'll never forget coming home from college in the middle, and he said, "Hey, I'm going to go paint curbs." And I was like, "Paint curbs? You teach college and you're probation officer and you sell insurance and you do all these different things in education." And he said, "No, for extra money, you'll come out here and help me." I remember being embarrassed that my dad was painting numbers on curbs for extra money to help support me for school. And so fast forward inside med school, I'm there and going through, and diabetes was ravaging his body. I remember my sister saying to me, Dad had Dad, why are you listening to Columbus? He said, well, after all, that's my son. He's looking out for me and he's going to make sure I'm taken care of. And so I remember going and watching my dad as he was passing away. And I'll never forget as I stopped by the house, as I oftentimes would, I was preparing to go out of town. I saw that look, and that look meant everything that I knew he didn't have long for this earth. And so in that moment, as I paused and I was there, everything came to a halt, as we were there when my dad passed away. And I went through a long period of time in which I was grieving. And I let a lot of things pass and so forth. And I remember it was only because of the seeds of resiliency that he imparted on me, he and my mom, that I was able to come out of it. And I started really searching, what did I miss? What did I miss that somehow I did wasn't a part of my dad's transformation, that our medications or pills didn't really do things. And so that was really the main trigger that led me to start to really research, and I stumbled. This is before the days of all the YouTube stuff and everything just so well promoted. And I stumbled upon a couple of books, one by Dr. Ornish, Dr. Furman, and Dr. Esselstyn. And I remember reading this around 2010. And at that point, the chapter that really rang and it struck home with me was about moderation kills. And so, you fast forward inside that moment as I started researching and going through the reference section, and then starting to really kind of pour into it and really seeing the power of the lifestyle that was there, that I knew I had to do something. And so I was a bit hesitant at that moment. I was hesitant to kind of dig into it and start advising my patients because as an interventional cardiologist, we kind of make our metal is formed by doing procedures and complex and showing that you're skilled. And so I was nervous about being the an African American interventional cardiologist, the only one that I knew of inside the area there. And now I'm recommending something different called lifestyle. And so I was hesitant. But I felt like my father and my father-in-law's life needed to mean something. And it was my sort of penance I was paying for not having the knowledge I needed to help them and impart care. So long story short, I started just talking to one or two patients, and that one or two patients, they started seeing transformations. And that those transformations led me to start constructing programs and bringing in dietitians into the program and started to do lectures and started to do cooking classes. And as I began to counsel patients back and forth, I realized that there was more to this thing called health than just food and just actually components. And that's what led me to really, I found myself from a verbal standpoint starting to make recommendations. And I realized there was one common thread. There was one common thread. There was one common threat that seemed to be persistent across male, female, racial demographics, financial demographics that seemed to underride every patient that I saw. And this was something that imposed what many would call was a major threat. And what was this threat that they all faced? You could easily say it was diabetes. You could easily say that it was high blood pressure. You could easily say that it was some other form of risk factor, high cholesterol. right? As we know, hypertension is a major contributor. But I found that was one thing, a common six-letter word we call stress. This idea of stress. So whether or not this patient was financially distraught and they brought home $1,500 a month, but yet their expenses were 2,000, that they felt stressed that somehow that the demands did not, the resources did not meet the demands. And so I found that this was not something that was uncommon, this idea of stress, that even research as late as end of 2023 told us about the fact that these stressful situations are a great threat not to our, and they're associated with poor health and well-being. That this is what studies have emphatically told us is that people experience more health and well-being issues when they become feeling overwhelmed by stressful situations. I don't know how many of you out there have felt stress. I have felt stress before. I felt stress many, many times inside my life. And the studies, primarily through the American Psychological Association, they validate this. It tells us that 77% of people experience stress that affects their physical health, that they may feel their heart beating. They may feel tension in their chest. They may feel back discomfort, neck discomfort. I always kind of share when we go on vacation, my wife and my kids and so forth, that I sleep like a baby. All of a sudden, I never have neck pain. But when I'm back and I'm busy and I'm doing a lot of things, and if things intensify, all of a sudden my neck starts to reach to crook up on me. And so we understand that people experience stress and it affects their physical as well as their mental health. That an individual's ability to deal with the stresses of life becomes overwhelming. And that's why the overall equation for stress is that stress can simply be characterized as a condition or feeling experience when a person perceives that the demands of life exceed their both personal and social resources. Now, I'll never forget, like as a new resident, a new person graduating from medical school, we call them interns. And so I was there, and this is back in the days when you had to walk uphill backwards and plow through snow and everything else of that sort, right? That's what those older guys say to the younger guys. And I'll never forget being up 36 hours straight. And they put regulations on that, which we'll talk about, which are extremely important. And I remember calling my sister and on the phone with her, and she asked me if I had taken care of this and that and the other for my parents. I remember saying, "Do you know what I'm doing for life? I'm busy." And she said, "Listen, you're not the only one who's stressed. I have a young baby. If I don't get sleep, something bad can happen to her." I didn't get mad at my sister. We didn't argue. I paused a moment and I remember that thinking that stress is an internal reaction to an external stimuli, that it's something that's individual to each person is what amounts. And so this idea that stress equals demands minus your perceived resources, right, becomes extremely important. And this is something that is faced globally. So what happens when we get stressed? We see this over time. And some say that an area of your brain called the amygdala becomes hijacked. So we have in the front of our brain, right behind this big noggin, like you see me, right above our eyes, this area, we call this the frontal bone. And the prefrontal cortex is the portion of the brain right behind here. This is where we reason. But deep seated in the middle of the brain, called the limbic system, the amygdala, you have this area that is like, this is like the brat in you. This is the area that just that all that little small little devil that's on your shoulder versus the little angel that's saying, no, I want this. I'm selfish. I want this, that, and the other. And so what happens is that when we first the sensory input starts to happen, and this feeds into a portion of the brain called the thalamus. It's in the data is then sent to the amygdala, and now the amygdala remembers everything. It remembers every slight. So I always tell individuals that I remember a kid watching a movie called Ben, where they had rats that just ate up everyone, and I got deathly afraid of it. And to this day, I'm deathly afraid of rats. Now, why am I still afraid of rats all these years later? Because my amygdala has held on to those memories. And it all of a sudden it associates that emotional sense with that visual stimuli. Right. And so once the amygdala does that, and then the data is sent to the cortex, the amygdala then it prevents the ability of the prefrontal, your thought process of saying, I shouldn't be afraid of rats. Columbus, you're a grown man. They can't hurt you. You're fine. It says, stop that. And that it prevents me from thinking like that, right? In that moment. And it allows me to then go ahead, as it blocks, it does this quick threat assessment and it blocks my ability to process this. And it gives me the unthinking response, which means fear, anxiety. And so the amygdala is a seat of fear and it hijacks your brain's ability to consciously think, I don't have to do this. This is the beginning of what happens when we see a threat, when we see stress that's there. And it then activates a portion of our hormonal system called the fight or flight. We get prepared to run or to fight. And this acute stressful situation occurs. And so a process begins as our body gets geared up for this, right? That the brain goes into action. It can prevent us from sleeping. The liver starts to release the blood sugar to give us the energy we need. Our digestion slows. Our urination begins to decrease and the oxygen and flow because the heart begins to pump stronger. It beats faster to deliver blood flow to the legs. This is needed when you're running away from a big lion or a dog is chasing you. This is important at that point in time. But when it's persistent, when it's constant, that can be a problem. And we know that too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. And so that's where studies have told us that yes, too little stress, sometimes we may become apathetic. We may not perform, that there's a sweet spot between not having any stress, but having stress that's beneficial for us. But when we get to the point that the stress is persistent, when we get to the point that the stress is too much, it leads to exhaustion and fatigue, it leads to anxiety, panic, and it leads to burnout. It breaks us down. And so this idea of the stress factor has been identified inside of research. It tells us that low perceived control is a determinant of heightened stress response and poor adaptation, which means that when you seem as if you don't have control, you're in a circumstance, a situation that you're faced with, your stress hormones begin to go berserk. That all of a sudden studies have told us that adversity and vulnerability, once again, this sense of being not being controlled, along with psychological markers, low self-esteem and loneliness, are associated with poor health outcomes. This actually sounds like during the COVID pandemic, doesn't it? That this sense of vulnerability, this sense of loneliness that's there, it plays a role. That studies have told us that this chronic exposure to stress, repeated, poor social supports and limited social networks, they've been shown to have an increase in disease risk. This is disease across the board. And you're like, well, man, how has this happened? So even studies have looked at social support at work. How well do you feel supported in your job place? That when people have low self-support, social support, they tend to have a higher burden of disease, higher mental health risk that are there compared to those who have the highest level of support, even at work. And you think, well, why is work important? You think 8 hours out of a 24-hour window, that's 33% of your day. Now, some of us are spending 8 to 12 hours. If you're spending close to 8 hours of sleep, that means you're spending equal periods of time between work and your personal life, your family. So work becomes important, that environment that's there, that this self-reported job control. Remember I said this loss of perceived control, that this is associated with increased heart disease risk, that we see that a low job control, the sense of control, increased risk is what the studies have shown. You think, well, how is that? The President of the United States has to be more stressful, but we see they have more control. You say, well, the Queen of England, she had more stress. Well, they lived a long period of life, but in individuals who have poor control at their job and other places, it's an increased risk and burden of heart disease is what we see on a regular basis. And so recent studies, they tell us that chronic stress, a important driver, what we call metabolic syndrome. Now, what is metabolic syndrome? It's just a little bit of increased weight around your waist. It's just a little bit of increased uh, uh, blood cholesterol, a small increase inside of, I have a touch of diabetes. That all these little bit adds up to an awful lot is what studies tell us. And so when this increased perceived stress in chronic disease, this range of chronic conditions, we see it's greatly increased. And this is, we see it in low income and middle income countries as well, the vulnerable, that we know that our marital stress can play a role, our significant others. So just as we see the benefit, and we'll talk about the benefit of intimate relationships, but we also know that when we sit and we are in toxic relationships, it increases our stress. And that's not really surprising to any of us. There is this increased association. That's where studies have shown for young adults who have had heart attacks, there is an independent association between severe marital stress and 1 year recovery. We also see too as well that stress and heart disease. We see other psychological issues that distress associated with major adverse cardiac events. That means heart attack. That means stroke. That means increased risk of death at 5 years. And this was presented at the American College of Cardiology scientific session several years ago. We see this on a regular basis. Other studies have told us that compared with patients with mild distress, those with severe distress um, um, oftentimes come from socially disadvantaged communities as well. Here's one of the things that's most concerning as I am raising a son and a daughter, although they're nearly out the house, almost empty nesters. My son will be graduating from high school. My daughter's the first year in college. But we see that this non-psychotic mental disorders in adolescent boys increases their risk for heart attack years and later in life. And so this is important that we're seeing this deluge of mental health issues that are arising. And I never thought as a cardiologist I would ever be dealing with mental health. I never thought I'd be dealing with food. I never would be thought I'd be dealing with stress at all. I just thought I'm dealing with coronary artery disease. It's separate, it's clean, I'm in and out. But we have to understand that there is an interplay between our health and our stress. And that's where I kind of have the equation that our health equals our resiliency divided by stress. That means that the higher your stress on that denominator, the poorer your health. The higher your stress, the poorer your health. And so this becomes important on what we do. And so how did I come to this equation? How did I come and start to recognize some of this stuff? Well, I explained to you some of the stressors in my own life as I started to kind of research some of this. But I started seeing an increase in patients that were hitting my table in the cath lab and in my clinic that it was never taught about. And so one a patient in particular, this was a 38-year-old female. And she was a high professional, a lawyer, and she came to the hospital after a sudden onset of discomfort in her chest. And it happened at rest. She was just there after a long day of work, traveled to her neck and her arm, and she had some dizziness and restlessness and breathlessness. And this sounded like a heart attack to everyone involved. She didn't have any risk factors. She was only 38, didn't know about any family members who had had an early onset of heart problems. She didn't smoke, didn't drink heavily, didn't have diabetes or high blood pressure or traditional risk factors at all. But we started doing the standard work that we do in the emergency room in the hospitals. We started drawing blood work on her. And one of the markers I always describe to patients that your heart and your organs are think of it like being comprised of millions of microscopic water balloons. So unless there's damage to one of the water balloons, you never see its contents being released into the bloodstream. But when there's damage to any degree, you may see a rise. And so we saw a rise in some of the markers that are attributed to the heart called troponin. And another one called CKMB. Although we didn't, this is obviously going back years ago, we don't check some of these any longer. So at that moment, my feeling was we have to rush this young lady into the procedure. So we took her in and took a look at her arteries of her heart. And Harvey, you're gonna have to trust me on this. On to the left of the screen is called the right coronary artery, and to the right of the screen is called the left coronary artery. I blended those images together. There was no significant blockages that were there, none whatsoever. So I went ahead and we did what's called assessed her heart function, both by an ultrasound at the bottom of the imaging of the screen, and it called an echocardiogram, as well as we placed the catheter into her ventricle and looked at the contractility of the heart. And what we found is instead of the heart squeezing in nicely as it should, it actually ballooned outward. So it went the opposite direction, which told us it was severely dysfunctional. And her heart function was markedly reduced, but the close neck part of it squeezed well. And it was something that scientists have told us is called Takotsubo disorder, also known as, which is a form in which the heart takes the shape of an octopus pot. It's called Takotsubo, and that hence the name. And we see this occurs under acute stress. And so one name is called stress-induced cardiomyopathy, but the other name is called the broken heart syndrome. Broken heart syndrome, stress-induced cardiomyopathy, that as a result of overwhelming stress, a person's heart can literally and figuratively break. And so scientists have uncovered that this idea of both emotional stress, severe, intense physical stress, this leads to this massive surge in stress hormones that then can, through a multiple, that seems to have an increased risk in certain individuals, females, in certain situations after menopause and so forth. And it results in this ballooning, as I described to you, in the injury of the heart muscle itself, paralyzing the heart instantly. This stress-induced cardiomyopathy, it's been shown after sporting events. It's been shown under acute stress and arguments at work and the pressure overloading. It's been shown in multiple entities, this idea of stress-induced cardiomyopathy. Now, here's bringing it back full circle, that scientists have revealed that individuals who develop subsequent tachycardia, excuse me, Takotsubo disorder or broken heart syndrome, they tend to have a higher baseline amygdala activity. Now, remember, I said the amygdala is this source of stress, this source of fear that's activated inside the whole cascade of stress. And so if one is under constant stress, this activity is constantly there in their amygdala. That means if they've had a lot of adverse childhood experiences called ACE, if they've had a lot of social stressful situations in the environment that they live, that they recognize stress everywhere they live, that they're in an environment at work or at home that's constantly there, that means this amygdala is constantly firing because they're sensing and recognizing this on a regular basis. And this is why this provides more insight to prior studies called Inner Heart Trial that told us that psychological stress, both at work and at home, increase the risk exponentially for a future cardiac event, especially in comparison to diabetes and all the traditional risk factors. So psychological stress is a major component. The higher our stress, the poorer our health. CDC has recognized it. The higher our stress, anxiety, depression, the higher the increased risk of stroke, heart failure, cardiometabolic disorder. And you may be asking yourself how. So I want you all to become, I want to knight you as cardiologists inside of this moment here. And so as we look at this sort of a thing and we look, well, how does this happen? All roads lead to the heart. There is an area, this pathway to the heart is something that is so important through the vasculature. And I'll tell you, this road leading to the heart, it's paved in something called the endothelium. You may have heard this term before. You may have heard it depending upon your proclivity towards lifestyle medicine. You may have heard it during the pandemic as the portal of entry for the coronavirus. And so this idea of the endothelium becomes so important and predictive of health. This is a single cell lining of the arteries. I oftentimes equate it to like this idea of a Teflon pan. Now, hopefully you all aren't cooking on this. But back in the day, before we came into knowledge and awareness, we might cook and pour different substances on here and nothing would stick to it. You know, back in the day when you were eating eggs and you're not doing that any longer, pouring cheese on that, you're not doing that any longer, that you wouldn't have to worry about them sticking to the pan because nothing sticks to it. That's like your endothelium. It's very protective. It allows the vessels to dilate and to constrict down. It's so important. And so as physicians, we can check this. And what we do is we're just going to compress the artery that tells us, is that lining, is it elastic? Does it rebound? Is it responsive or is it not? And so we can do that through a series of an ultrasound as well as with blood pressure. Now, we don't do it inside the office very much. This is typically done inside of research bases, but we're looking to see, has that pan become dysfunctional? Has that lining been eroded? Is there now damage to the endothelium, as we see in this old pan? And that when that endothelial damage happens, all of a sudden the scales get tilted towards disease. No longer is that lining of the vessel able to dilate. No longer is it able to inhibit growth, is prevent inflammation and clot formation like Superman. It's a super filled area. It now leads to the vessel just tightening up and being constricted. It leads to excessive growth and narrowing of the vessel and clot formation and inflammation. And here's the thing, we've revealed that stress plays a role that leads to, at the bottom of the screen, endothelial dysfunction and this idea of hardening of the vessels and invagination called atherosclerosis or arteriosclerosis. So much so that scientists have begun doing research saying that let's put people to a stress. Now, typically what they do is they say, well, let's do public speaking. All right. Now I get a little bit of shelter because I can't see your faces, but I understand distinctly that when I'm speaking to highly educated individuals who are knowledgeable, there's a level of stress that rises. And this actually has been reflected in this lining of the vessel, that the vessel temporarily becomes dysfunctional under increased mental stress. as they assess it through what this area called flow mediated dilatation, as I described, where we compress the vessel and see how quickly it rebounds up if it's dysfunctional or not. So you can imagine if you're under repeated stress and that your function goes down, it starts to come up, you're under more stress, it goes down, you're having these repeated insults that leads to an issue. So much so they did looked at studies in the youth and they found that this persistent chronic stress, it lends itself to dysfunction in this endothelium. And so scientists began to even explore this a little bit further. And they said not only is it stress associated with just this level of activity, mental stress, it's the stressors of what we do. It's our food, it's our behavior. All these things lead to a sequence that triggers stress inside of our body and ultimately will activate through the amygdala and leads to this dysfunction of the endothelium. This slide, because you're going to become cardiologists. Remember, I'm knighting you. This is important to understand. And so other studies have told us, once again, reaffirming this concept. Say, looking at nearly 300 individuals who were free of heart disease, underwent full body scans, those scans offered inside the fairs and so forth, to look at their brain activity. And it had a telling result that 5 years later, those who had high activity in the amygdala, as I described, that area that senses the fear, the area that recognizes the threats that are there, the greatest threat being stress, were shown to have higher levels of inflammation and atherosclerosis 5 years later. That studies have shown that when you live in disparate environments, a lower socioeconomic status, so perhaps you're fearful of the environment, you're fearful of individuals of authority, that all of a sudden it's associated with a higher amygdala activity and it independently predicts major adverse cardiac events through a pathway very similar that triggers the inflammation that through the bones and it triggers destabilization of these plaques that develop over time. Stress adds another layer. Many times people ask me, Doc, I've been eating well. How did I still have a heart attack? How did I still have this happen or that happen? Stress plays a major role, that everything in life adds to our resiliency or adds to our stress. Other studies have told us, re-amplifying this, that acute mental stress, it amplifies this whole inflammation. Now, this was a mouse study years ago, and it leads to what we call plaque vulnerability. So, okay, I'm gonna pause for a moment because you all are becoming cardiologists. I have to make sure I give you this. You need to make sure you capture this. That your arteries of your heart are like pimples. I told you I have teens, right? They deal with pimples on their skin and so forth at times. And what is a pimple? It's a mass. You get this white fluid that's there. You get this raised area that may become red. This is happening on the inside of your arteries. This inflammation, this outpouching happens in the lining of the vessels. All of a sudden, it can burst just like a pimple, but it's except inside of the vessel. Now your body goes into overdrive trying to stop that area from this eruption, heal it, and the clot forms and leads to a heart attack. So this instability in terms of the pimple happens under mental stress. Under mental stress, people may have a breakout. Same thing happens inside of their body, on the inside that's there. That this studies have told us that symptoms of increased burnout and depression, anxiety, it's associated with an inflammatory marker called C-reactive protein, which is very predictive of future cardiac events. So this is all the stuff to worry about. I don't want you to worry so much inside here because here's the thing. It's not just stress. Stress is just one aspect of it. It's not the stress that kills us. It's our reaction to it. In other words, states out of the words of a pastor, Chuck Swindoll, he said that life it's 90% of how we respond, 10% of what actually happens to us. How we choose to respond is so important. And many of us need to we turn to fake resources. In the words of Doug Lisle and so forth from his book, it's the motivational triad. We try to exert the least amount of effort possible. We're seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. And this leads us to bad habits. These unhealthy bad habits, which are persistent, that instead of us going and engaging our spouse and others, we want to sit and watch TV. Well, I'm sorry, today's day and age. We sit and scroll through TikTok or Facebook or Instagram to get our enjoyment, disconnecting from others. That we seek pleasure through use of acceptable drugs, right? Alcohol or smoking marijuana to unwind or de-stress, or perhaps it's food. that we avoid pain by building walls in our relationships. So in that way, someone can't hurt us again. But and so these are the things that begin to happen. And SAES have told us here recently that during the pandemic, when stress was at an all-time high, we saw tobacco, alcohol, and other drugs increase in use. That we saw that these things were happening on a regular basis when we compared it before and after. That we're seeing that the term for with our teens and young adults with vaping, nicotine, and marijuana are significantly more likely to experience these stress and anxiety. So instead of them helping, they're causing more issues. But I'll tell you, there's another habit that's more acceptable than the idea of the e-cigarettes and so forth, which are horrible, and alcohol. It's our food. That we've turned to this idea of the comfort food, that we somehow feel that stress equals dessert spelled backwards, and we turn solely to this idea, right? That this processed food that gives us, it helps us remember the motivational triad, right? That I just kind of talked about. We talked about three things: that we want to seek pleasure, we want to avoid pain, right? And exert the least amount of energy. That's what comfort food is. I go through the drive-through, no energy expenditure. I swipe my card, no energy expenditure. I bite into the food that's there. Now I'm going to get this immediate surge, and I'm thinking that it's helping me inside this moment. I'm not having to avoid, no one sees me, so I'm avoiding the pain of it. We have this idea on a regular basis, but studies tell us that the consumption of fast food and the levels of stress are directly proportional to each other. And this means that low levels of stress were associated with low levels of consumption of food, of fast food, and vice versa. That means that it triggers it. There is a real distinct relationship. Whether it's causation or correlation, we're seeing a relationship. I want to propose to you that the health of America is broken. We have a broken heart, right? As a result of the stress, as a result of our nutritional stress that's there. But I want to tell you, it's never too late to turn the direction, change the direction we're going in life. That we can transform and change it. I'll tell you, it's no surprise that the data surrounding the health outcomes of America compared to other industrialized countries are poor as they are when we look at the rise of stress and nutritional stress that we see all around. The wonder is not that so many are ruined, but that so many survive. We have to kind of turn our attention and kind of look, what is the secret sauce that can help us build a level of resiliency, that can help us achieve the health we all want so we can live our best life? And I want to tell you that I've given you a lot of despair that's here. I want to tell you, there is a rose in the concrete. What is a rose in the concrete? There was one great poet that was there named Tupac Shakur. Said, "Did you hear about the rose that grew from the crack in the concrete?" Proving nature's law is wrong. It learned to walk without having feet. Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams, it learned to breathe fresh air. Long live the rose that grew from concrete when no one else ever cared. I want to tell you that I care for you. And the reason why is because I believe that there is a rose amidst all of the despair that's there in this world right now. That I believe that your health is there. You deserve to live your healthiest life. That health equals resiliency divided by stress. The health equals resiliency divided by stress. We need to commit to building our resiliency. As we commit to building our resiliency through multiple aspects, through our nutrition, everything we do will play a role in this, that we can achieve the health we desire to live a life of purpose. And so, as I begin to give these pearls to my patients over the years, and I'm a huge sports fan, so I got into the debate of who's greatest. Is it Bron? Is it Kobe? Is it MJ? Is it Jordan? One of the things that Jordan said, Michael Jordan, that is, to the left, for those of you who are not sports fans out there wearing Bulls number 23, he said, to be successful, you have to be selfish, or else you have never achieved. Now, some may look at this and say, well, Doc, I was told not to be selfish. I told my kids not to be selfish, all these things like that. I'm telling you, you have to get selfish in order to achieve that. Jordan actually was right. Now, he meant it in terms of living his best life, of performing, of exercising, and making that front and central towards achieving his goals. And to some degree, we have to do that to achieve a goal despite others around us. But I mean selfish in a different way. I mean selfish, that we have to get selfish. And what I mean by selfish is there's a multi-tiered component. S stands for spiritual. E stands for exercise, L for love, F for food, real food, whole food, plant-rich foods. I stands for intimacy of relationships. The S stands for sleep. The H stands for humor or joy of life. And as we dig into these, what do these mean? How can they really help us? Are they really going to help heal my stressed and broken heart? The answer is absolutely a resounding yes. In the words of Ian Goller, meditation or prayer is the single most powerful tool to aid recovery from disease and lead to a life of maximum health. That studies have told us that when a person engages in meditation and yoga as a form of it, that they significantly improve their endothelial function. That means that lining, remember I told you about that, in healthy individuals and as well as patients with cardiovascular disease or risk factors. So all of a sudden we see that just this process of meditation, this calming, right? That's there, this focus that begins to happen in our prefrontal cortex, the breathing that ensues, that tends to heal and relax that endothelial function. That studies have told us that the relative risk for cardiovascular disease mortality was significantly reduced by up to 81% individuals who meditate, which means reflecting in thoughtful reflection compared to those in the control group. The other studies have told us as they randomize, which means they take two groups of individuals. To one, they give one strategy of care. To another, they give a different strategy of care. And this was in this particular meditation on metabolic syndrome. Remember, I told you just a little bit of increased weight, a little bit of elevated cholesterol, a little bit of high blood pressure in subjects with coronary artery disease. And it showed that those who engaged in this mindset showed an improvement in their blood sugar levels, their insulin levels were observed in this group compared to those who were just given solely health education. That's power that's there. Studies demonstrate that meditation increases the mental performance. So remember, the prefrontal cortex is where we make our plans, where we decide. This is where we plan and reason. And so oftentimes, how many of you guys wake up in the middle of in the morning and you're like, I'm going to be great today. All of a sudden, by the end of the day, all those plans you had kind of go to the wayside after the stress and the decisions happen over and over. The moments of meditation help to strengthen the prefrontal cortex as a sense of lifting weights. But here's the other aspect that when we take deep breaths, something called the physiologic sigh, that means you take, like, we can learn a lot from our kids. So our kids, oftentimes when they're crying, they're like, Mommy, Dad, I want this, that, and the other. They're, "Ah, ah." Well, that's something called the physiologic sigh. That when we take an initial deep breath, a long inhalation followed by a short inhalation and a prolonged exhalation, we actually can decrease our stress hormones. Let's do it together. In that moment, that helps lower your stress hormones. That when we exhale and breathe out, that activates our parasympathetic tone to decrease the stress or the constriction of the vessels. There's power that's there in our breathing. That when we look at studies in comparison, that these things are so important. So in a moment, what do I encourage myself to do, myself and others, is I'll do simply either the physiologic side or I'll do box breathing, where I'm breathing in, counting to four. I hold my breath, counting to four. I breathe out, counting to four. And I hold my breath, counting to four. And I repeat that cycle for 3, 4, 5 times just to calm myself. There's power that's there. And not everything that counts can be counted. Right? And not everything that counts, excuse me, not everything that can be counted counts. And not everything that can be counted, that counts can be counted. See, I'm gonna stumble over my own words with that as I get stressed with you all day. Let me take some more deep breaths. So, what's the E stand for? The E stands for exercise. That Nelson Mandela said, exercise is the key not only to physical health but also to peace of mind. A brief word about the meditation and prayer. As you're planning your journey towards improved wellness and health, and incorporating meditation and prayer or deep breathing, part of it is that the benefit is you're saying, what are the plans that I have that I'm putting out there that can help my nutritional journey, that can help decrease my burden of cardiovascular disease. And as we move towards exercise, that planning, even as I'm planning my exercise, we're going to see how this is intertwined. That studies have told us, yes, indeed, the more physically fit you are, the more activity. So typically, METs is a measurement we do inside of the clinic, and it tells us the fact that individuals who are active, if you do house cleaning, climbing stairs, it's between 4 and 8 METs, we characterize it. And so you start to kind of, as you increase your level of activity, to jogging, to being active, playing tennis, or doing CrossFit, or doing Peloton, or gardening, you'll see that the number of exertion, your physical fitness increases. And we see as your physical fitness increases, and you go to the right of the screen, on the left bar, or that left line talks about your relative risk for cardiovascular events. It goes down exponentially the higher your fitness level is. But it's not just about that from a overall heart standpoint. We know that it helps alleviate the stress. That individuals who are stratified to being sedentary were 3 times more likely to have elevated perceived stress, their perception of life circumstances, compared to those who engage in activity. That other studies have told us that when you engage in continuous high intensity aerobic exercise, that it favorably affects the endothelial, that lining of the vessels once again. These different types of aerobic exercises have different impact on the arterial stiffness. There's power that's there. But it's not just that when we engage and we're just weekend warriors, that studies have told us. And so this is something called the forest plot. And so you'll see at the bottom of the screen, if your eyes can acclimate towards it, it shows the number 1, which is a hazard ratio. Anything above 1 means that it's increased risk. And so studies told us when you're active weekend warrior, for atrial fibrillation, a regular heartbeat, for myocardial infarction, a heart attack, for heart failure, or for stroke, where the arrows are, that it decreases the risk, right? Your risk is lower for having of those, even when you're engaging in activity. It's telling us that any activity is a good activity. Even better is an activity you can sustain. That when you engage in leisure time activity, if you like going for walks, if you like to dance, if you like to play pickleball or tennis or go golfing, that these have value to you, that these increase and decrease, they're effective in primary prevention of cardiovascular disease by up to 20% and increase life expectancy. There's power. I always tell the story of stress and exercise, that when we engage in exercise, especially exercise outdoors, or called green exercise, forest bathing, walking through nature, that lowers our stress hormone is what studies have told us. To give the example of my daughter, I never forget when she was around, she's 19 now, as I mentioned, she was around 12 or so. So in that preteen stage, and I talk about this in my book, and one of the things she was like, she was just grumpy. So I took her on a walk, and she had her arms folded and everything like that. So I started telling her dad jokes, and all these different things. And she has like just the lemon lips face on there. She's just walking. And so as we're walking outdoors, she did not want to go for a walk. All of a sudden I noticed her arms dropped to her side as we're continuing to walk. And I'm just talking to her. I'm just talking, right? And she's not responding. Next thing I know, she starts to smile a little bit. Next thing I know, she starts to chuckle. As we were approached, turning the curve to go back home, she says to me, Dad, you're right. This feels good. I said, that's right, babe. Always remember, exercise, sunlight, these are medicines that we have that can help change even our mood, even our outlook on life. What's the L stand for? Love. I don't mean just that regular love. I mean love as an action. Anyone who's loved anything or anybody knows that that takes work. Just ask my wife. It takes work to love someone like me. That means it's a verb, it's not a noun, that you have to love yourself enough to live a healthy life. And this is a picture of my wife and my son from years ago, when he was just a itty bitty baby. He was so lovable. And this idea of the power of physical touch is so powerful, that this idea of the love hormone oxytocin is released with this touch. And we know that oxytocin, when you're feel comforted in a enriching environment, that your inflammation goes down, the inflammatory response and improvement of your cardiovascular and metabolic profile. That studies have told us that touch is one of the first senses that we start working on in the womb, around 14 weeks. From the moment we're born, this gentle caress of the mom, and like my wife gave to my son, has multiple health benefits. It lowers our heart rate, improves our growth of the brain concentrations. And so when someone hugs us, make sure that person wants to hug you. Don't say doc told me to touch someone inappropriately. But when that hug is welcome and it's appropriate, the stimulation of the tactile afferents in our skin is signals, right, in the spinal cord to the brain's emotion processing these networks. And this induces a whole cascade of neurochemical signals. These have the power of health benefits that I'll tell you that even our neuroscientists that they've concluded that this oxytocin it plays the role inside of this social bonding, and this is released. It slows down the heart rate, as I mentioned, decreasing the stress and anxiety levels, and it releases endorphins into these brain's reward pathways, all derived from this hug. That hug has such a relaxing and calming effect. It also can benefit our health in many other ways. That we see this, that when it makes us less reactive to stress and it helps build our resiliency. There's power that's there in these simple things of life. That love in action means volunteering, giving of yourself. That studies have shown that when we volunteer, when we do something without expecting anything in return, it increases our happiness. We're going to talk about happiness and humor. It have less pain, decrease the risk of heart disease, better physical health, and increasing expended life expectancy. It's like Honda's giving moments. It's like pay it forward that Starbucks you go through if you're getting some green tea, right? That all of a sudden, and someone pays for it, you feel good. They feel good for doing something nice, and it counteracts the idea of stress and anger. We look at health overall. That love and action means forgiveness, self-forgiveness. Forgive yourself. Forgive yourself. Forgive others. Let go. That when they randomize individuals towards who had anger, increased anger, and anger recall. Into one group, they put them through a forgiveness learning where they documented this over a 10-week period of time. And before they did this, they took imagery of the heart, a scan to look for absence of blood flow in certain components of the heart. They found that the group that they put through the forgiveness and learned to forgive when they recalled the anger, that they had improved blood flow compared to the group that never learned how to forgive. It can impact the blood flow to the heart. The studies have shown that when we engage in moments of gratitude, being grateful, that it decreases inflammatory markers, improves our endothelial function, and improves our overall health adherence. Now, food obviously is a central component. The food is important. The food we eat can be the safest and most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison. I recognize that the caveat at the beginning of our conversation, I told you about my dad, and my dad was a healthy guy, relatively, in terms of society. They would say he ate pretty well. He was moderate. He didn't really eat much meat. He never drank. He never smoked. He liked his sweets. Everyone would say he was pretty moderate. I'll tell you, this is what resonates, that moderation can kill. We never know what the impact is on our bodies from even the smallest dose of poison versus the largest dose. So it's better suited to make sure we're adhering to as many green foods as possible, green light foods, not red light foods that are going to definitely cause harm, not yellow light foods, as I taught my kids how to drive. We have to make sure we have to feed our body to fight stress. We have to feed our body with the resiliency it needs because our health equals resiliency over stress. That studies have shown that compared to individuals who hardly consumed any fruits and vegetables, for those who consumed 3 to 4 servings were 12% less likely to experience stress or perceive stress. And those who consumed 5 to 7 servings per day were 14% less likely to perceive stress than those who had 0 to 4. There's power in our lifestyle. Yes, was it directly from the fruits and vegetables? I like to say I think there's a mechanism of how that can happen, but we don't know for sure if it was causation or correlation. But as we add on things, we start to realize there's power that's there, that the seeds and nuts, I don't mean butter toffee peanuts, I don't mean roasted and all these other things. I mean raw seeds and nuts that are measured, small amounts, less than 2 or 3 tablespoons a day, right? That what studies have shown, it's a powerhouse of nutrition and can greatly improve your mental health. Decreasing that stress burden is what we're talking about. Pumpkin seeds are rich in zinc. Walnuts are rich in omega-3s, and it helps our memory and brain function. That when we look overall, that researchers have found that eating blueberries, I have a whole big canister of blueberries and raspberries, strawberries, and blackberries right now I've been feeding on. It helps reduce the genetic and biochemical drivers of depression and suicidal ideation associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. So we need to make sure we recognize, are we feeding our body? Are we adding to our resiliency or adding to our stress? The studies have told us that turmeric, curcumin, especially it's activated with the mixture of black pepper, that it's effective in its own in combination with another herb, saffron, in decreasing stress, depression symptoms. This is powerful. This was identified, especially inside of women. The study was done primarily there around the perimenopausal, excuse me, premenstrual period of time too as well. That studies have shown too as additionally, consumption of dark chocolate, small amounts, postage stamp side, may be able to help decrease perceived stress. Now we all probably can get on board with a little bit of dark chocolate, right? Also probiotics. Look at kimchi and various aspects there, decreasing the stress in healthy volunteers and may alleviate stress-related subthreshold anxiety and depression levels. But we also know we have to use nutritional resiliency to heal our broken heart. Studies have told us that when we engage in green leafy vegetables, and so this means our spinach and bok choy and Swiss chard and mustards and collards, that we are decreasing at least 1 cup a day. That's not much. Of this vegetable nitrates, dietary nitrates, it lowers our risk for ischemic heart disease, heart failure, and stroke, and peripheral arterial disease by 12, 15, 17, and 26%. That's astronomical. One of the benefits that have been identified is that there is a component of vitamin K2, which may be able to decrease some of that atherosclerosis or coronary calcification. More work is being done inside that area there. But these studies have shown substantially, other studies have told us about decreasing the risk and burden of blood pressure and subsequently lowering the risk of heart disease, as I mentioned, up to 26%. Beets are a powerhouse. They help our endothelium. They help our blood flow that's there. Studies have shown now, I'll be honest, I didn't care for beets, but we know after several weeks, your taste buds start to shift. I like beets now. And before when I didn't, what I did was I bought frozen beets and or I come up and froze them and put inside my smoothies. That this helps with the blood pressure. It helps with the endothelium and lowering the blood pressure by nearly 8/5 millimeters of mercury, which is substantial, as we know that each 1 millimeter of mercury can decrease your burden and future risk of cardiovascular disease by 15 to 20%. What about whole grains? Whole grains, I don't mean the labels that are written as whole grains, the stuff that you have to chew. Your jaw gets tired when you're having it. That Ezekiel 4:9 bread, that each serving can decrease overall mortality. It can decrease your cardiovascular mortality by 9%, is what studies have told us, primarily of nurses' health study. And so these things are powerful. That's there. They also diversify your gut microbiome as well. That when we look at these components of plant-rich foods, fiber-rich foods, of soy and legumes and so forth, that studies have shown as it relates to our cholesterol, that lowers our burden of cholesterol, our bad cholesterol, markers of inflammation that are there astronomically in comparison, comparable to some low dose statin therapies. This is wonderful work that was done by David Jenkins and reported years ago that we see once again validating the power to heal a broken heart in its risk factors. That eating our beans and legumes. I had someone yesterday say, "I don't like beans." I said, "You're an adult. What do you mean you don't like? You have to keep trying it at least 2, 3 times in different ways until your body can get acclimated to it." So whether or not it's split peas, whether or not it's lentils, red beans, black beans, the studies have told us that 4 times or more per week with less than compared to less once a week was associated with a 22% lower risk of coronary heart disease and 11% of vascular disease. We talked about nuts as it relates to mental health, but also we know that there is, once again, it's multiple. We look at the size of this. Nearly 467,000 individuals, the highest versus lowest nut consumption decreased the risk of overall mortality and cardiovascular mortality or death. So once again, I'm not talking about snacking. I'm a snackaholic. I'm a recovering snackaholic. I can kill a bag or whatever of nuts. I don't do that. I'm sprinkling no more than a couple of tablespoons of raw seeds or nuts on various aspects that are there. Spice is the thing of life. We want to get away from the salt, increase our spices, not just curcumin, but the multitude of spices. It helps in terms of with our combat oxidation too as well. It's rich in antioxidants. It helps improve triglyceride concentrations as well. Powerful that's there. When we look at the components, the other components of a deep, enriched, diverse, plant-rich diet, We understand that this adherence is lower overall burden of cardiovascular events. We're trying to add to it as we add the onions and the allium family that helps decrease the platelet adherence, onions and garlic. That's what they do and help improve the enrichment. The celery, which acts as a natural diuretic, that's there. We're getting the bell pepper, which is giving you vitamins. We're getting the potatoes, which is giving you protein and nutrients. Not the potatoes with all the cheese and the bacon and everything of that sort. We're staying away from that. The green leafy vegetables that are giving you dietary nitrates. That's where the power lies. Using our food as medicine. That's where it becomes important, and medicine as our foods. The I in selfish stands for intimacy. Charles Caleb Colton said, true friendship is like sound health. The value of it is seldom known until it is lost. Wonderful work that's being done. University of Brigham Young University, Julianne Holt Lundstad. She compared the effects of loneliness, isolation, sounds like the COVID pandemic. It's comparable to smoking 16 cigarettes a day. This is why the Surgeon General said that loneliness is a public health risk. We understand that when we engage in healthy relationships, not toxic relationships, it can decrease our perceived stress and this appraisal process as well and promote a positive affect. My parents said as a kid growing up, Columbus, guard who you are friends with. They say birds of a feather flock together, and they're so right that right now, through the work here, this group, you're creating a small microcosm of a community that's here. That hopefully you will see it go forward. And this community allows you to encourage each other towards this improved state of health, of understanding the power of your choices, of things that you do that are adding to your resiliency or adding to your stress. Your friends or your family that you choose. But it's not just our friends, our human ones. It's how about our animal family? How about our sentient beings that we have here too as well? That research have observed this consistent pattern of higher amounts of hormone oxytocin, this bonding, this lowering, this anti-stress hormone, and lower amounts of stress hormone cortisol in those who interact with their social support animals. So I'll tell you, my mom lives with me. I don't live with my mom, right? I don't live with my mom. My mom lives with me. At age 89, I can say it because she's a beautiful woman, right? And she'll be 89 this upcoming June. And so she has 5 kids, 5 siblings. I'm the pleasant surprise, the youngest. And my daughter one time said, she calls her Jaja. Jaja, who's your favorite? Kind of smirking at me, thinking like, oh, she's going to say you dad or whatever. And she said, Precious. Well, I don't have a sibling named Precious. You know what Precious is? Precious is her dog. And guess what Precious does? Precious knows when my mom's sad. She knows if my mom's having a little bit of arthritic pain. She understands all that she is her support. They communicate with each other. I recently read research that the intonations of animals as they're barking, that scientists have uncovered that there is humor that's there. It's playful, certain tones that are there, that they have certain aspects, and that we know when Precious, my mom communicates with Precious, knows when Precious needs to go out and pee. She knows if Precious is happy, excited, all those things they communicate. There's power that's there. I want to tell you that as an intimacy, as a community, as a society, as Americans, we need to learn from trees. In the words of Peter Wohlleben, he said, all the trees here in every forest that is not too damaged are connected to each other through underground fungal networks, the world wide wood, right? Or the wood wide web, excuse me, that trees share water and nutrients. They share resources through their networks, also allow them to communicate. That means the trees that are damaged or are low and aren't able to receive the nutrients from the sun, the larger trees share it with them, is what studies have shown. We have to begin this process of having intimate relationships that have been reflected throughout the dawn of time. That when we move on to what's the next pillar of selfish? Sleep, rest, vacation, moments of solitude. That Thomas Dekker said, sleep is the golden chain that ties health and our bodies together. And this is indeed true. Sleep is powerful. That how many of you guys have gone to sleep struggling, wondering about a problem? You wake up and you have the answer. You go to sleep wondering what's going to happen as it pertains to where your keys are, and you all of a sudden you remember where they're at. How many of you have gone to sleep and you haven't gotten sleep and you're stressed and you seem to be more inclined to be stressed the next day? Well, this is what studies have told us that after adjusting for age, employment status, physical comorbidities, perceived stress was significantly associated with sleep disturbances. That means you have insomnia, you have sleep apnea, you're not able to go. While resilience and social support were associated with a low likelihood of sleep disturbance. The better your sleep, the more resilient you are. That means that sleep adds to your resiliency and sleep can add to your stress. That studies have shown that adults who sleep less than 8 hours, I don't know how many of you guys slept less than 4 hours last night. How many of you guys slept 4 to 6? How many of you guys slept 7 to 9? Right? Studies have told us that adults who sleep fewer than 8 hours a night report higher stress levels that they perceive than those who sleep at least 8 hours. That means that you become like Teflon. It means that everything flows off of you, that you become fluid in those moments. But here's the thing, that sleep also impacts our endothelium. That individuals who slept their 8 hours or more had improved endothelial function compared to those who did not. That those who did not have, who were sleep deprived, have poor endothelial, that lining of the vessel function, which lends itself to disease. And we've subsequently, this is why we understand distinctly that ischemic heart disease, cancer, stroke, all these causes, right, of mortality were increased with sleeping less than 6 hours. Or actually, on the other end, when you sleep more than 9 hours, that sweet spot like Goldilocks, you tend to do the best. That's here. That this sleep deprivation, it is activating your stress hormone cascade, and it tilts the scale towards disease that's there. Our sleep, our rest, our vacation, the moments away becomes so important to nix in it, right? My wife introduced this to me from a business perspective. This is something out of the Netherlands of Nixon, Niksen. That means the art of doing nothing. That's hard for me, being honest. That's hard for me. It may be hard for you to Nixon and not do anything and allow the body and mind to reset. It becomes important. We do it for our cars, our electric cars. We do it for our phones. They have to charge up. We have to charge our body. Now, Ben Franklin, in a different life, I would have been a history instructor. Love historical figures. And so Benjamin Franklin is once quoted as saying, trouble knocked at the door, but hearing laughter hurried away. That laughter is a substance of life. That humor and joy of life is so important. Studies have told us that the frequency of laughter attenuates the association between stressful events and subsequent stress symptoms. But here's the key. Here's the power. The level of intensity of laughter was not found to have a significant effect. Now, what that means is that even if you chuckle, that was funny, versus you're laughing, literally laughing out loud, they both give you a beneficial effect. They both give you a beneficial effect. That when you smile, try this, try smiling and looking upward and see if you can have negative thoughts. That when you smile, it lowers your blood pressure. As you begin this idea, of course, laughter, of joy, of finding joy in things in life, it is extremely helpful. This study looked at, compared to a control group, psychological stress levels and salivary cortisol levels were lower in the humor group, those who found humor in life, who laughed, yet no differences were found in response time, accuracy rates for the visual search task. So they had put folks inside these different groups trying to identify what was going on in their perception of stress, and found stress hormone levels were lower in those who engaged in laughter, who engaged in humor, and found joy in life. That studies have shown that even after adjustment for high cholesterol, high blood pressure, depression, body mass index, and other factors, the prevalence of heart disease among those who never or almost never laugh was nearly 21% times higher than those who reported laughing every day. Have you laughed? It's one of the questions I'd ask my patients. And the stroke rate was nearly 60% higher. Are you finding joy in life? Now, as we wrap things up, one of my roles inside my medical group organization is I'm the medical director for our virtual cardiac rehabilitation program. So cardiac rehab, to some of those of you who are familiar with the work of Dean Ornish and others, is the work that was done there, the Pritikin Institute, of a combination of exercise, stress reduction, nutrition. But so in this research, a very novel research, what they did was they took this group, understanding the power of it for patients who suffer with a heart attack, with stroke, with vascular disease, heart failure. They should be enrolled inside these programs because of the value of the program. But they said, we're going to take individuals in these programs, but to one group, we're going to tell you we want you to laugh for 30 minutes. We don't care how you do it. If it's your raunchiest comedian, if it's your dumbest sitcom comedy show, if it's Three's Company, if it's Saved by the Bell, if it's Big Bang Theory, whatever makes you laugh, you watch it. The other group, they just said, keep doing what you're doing. All the other beneficial effects of cardiac rehab. what they found was a divergence in the outcomes. They found that the individuals who added laughter, humor, joy of life to their rehab sessions every day, they said that were less likely to have chest pain. They found that they were less likely to have recurrent admissions to the hospital with chest discomfort or with shortness of breath. They found that they tended to live longer over the period of time that they observed them. There is power when we engage in humor. And so this is important. So one of the things I want to leave you with today is that you need to go ahead and get selfish. It's your time. You deserve to get selfish. You deserve to live a life of health. You deserve to live a life of purpose. That when you get selfish, the selfish I'm talking about, you're able to live a life of purpose and achieve the things that you need. And so it's been a pleasure presenting this to you here today. And you are now all will get your certificate, right? From Steve and others about what that you become an honorary cardiologist today. And I want you to become selfish individuals, selfish, so you can live a life of purpose. Thank you. I'll take any questions anyone has now.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Batiste. That was a great presentation. So we're going to begin the Q&A portion of the presentation. And for audience members who would like to ask a question of Dr. Batiste, you can go ahead and raise your hand in chat. The directions for how to do so, excuse me, raise your hand in Zoom. The directions for how to do so are in chat. And we can go ahead and begin with the questions. So, so first of all, it's a much different perspective than we normally get from cardiologists and people who talk about heart health. You normally, especially in this conference, we hear a lot about food. Obviously, so it's great to see the pathophysiology for how stress impacts health. Um, what are now? I've heard of things of intentionally inducing stress to the body in order to increase resilience, such as infrared saunas, high heat, as well as cold plunge. How does that play a role in moderating stress and generating overall health?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so one of the things that we look at, even I'll tweak it because I'm not as familiar with that it's been elucidated as quite as well in terms of like cold plunging and infrared sauna, although truth be told, I do both of those. One of the things that we do identify is that in exercise, that this ends up acting more so as a form of stress to our bodies when we engage in exercise. And so that's well recognized that that's stress. But what that's doing is you have to think of those stressor events for these temporary, almost like a training camp of that's preparing the body to how to respond and getting in understanding in terms of the response process. And so from a physiologic standpoint, it makes us more resilient for these short-term bursts of stress. So when we look at using exercise specifically, we find that the beneficial effects of intense exercise are probably maximally achieved by about 30 minutes. After about 30 minutes or so, you're not really getting the added benefit. And at a certain point, you actually have a decline in terms of the beneficial effects. So these are some of the reasons, and this is part of the reason why we mentioned as we go down the dovetail of exercise for just a moment, of why it's important when we're saying as little as 2 minutes, 10 minutes becomes so exceptionally important in that process of achieving health, why we see health benefits from these small repeated. Now, in terms of like the other aspects that are there in terms of the sauna and deep tissue massaging and in terms of the cold plunge, all these things are valuable. And there has been some small studies I've seen as it relates to kind of endothelial function related to some of these two as well.
Great, thank you. And you spoke in your presentation about there being stress coming from not having control or perceived control. And a lot of us, who aren't the bosses in their life, with their job or maybe not even at home,
Tell me about that one.
yeah, exactly. May be in a position where they don't really have control. And is there a way without changing the circumstances of your life to give yourself more control to undermine the damage being done in having that lack of control?
That's a great question. And so part of one of the things that I've come to a realization, recognition is that we all are beholden to someone. What I have control of is my response. I have control of how I choose to respond in a situation. And so let me give you an example for me, because you may say, well, doc, you're in control, you're a doctor, right? Or hey, you do these leadership roles or whatever else. I remember being inside of I'll give you two different scenarios. One scenario, my clinic was double book, triple booked in a few slots without my approval. I had meetings to go to and everything else. I walked in and I was like stressed. How am I going to, once again, the demands exceeded my perceivable resources. I needed to be in multiple places at once. I was stressed. I didn't have control at that point. Now patients were there, they were waiting. And so in that moment, I was stressed. I started my day very stressed. And for some reason, I stopped and I said, Columbus, all you can do is what you can do. Just what's in front of you at each moment. At that point, I said, I have control of how I'm choosing to respond in this moment. Day is going to happen the way it's going to happen. I'll send my regrets to people if I'm late. I'm going to take care of. And in that moment, my day went much better. Now, that's juxtaposed with other days in which I allowed myself to go into this vicious funnel. And I'm snapping at my back office staff and I'm walking in smiling with patients. I walk out, I snap at them. They don't know, so patients don't know, and I'm feeling this mountain hill of stress that my day is horrible. And I feel a tightness in my body. My blood pressure is elevated. And so that's what I mean by control. And that's where the statement that comes in that's so valuable, that life is 10% what happens to you, 90% how you respond. And I'm not tone deaf enough to recognize the fact that travesties and atrocities against human beings that happen, that they have, you can't have that mindset in certain situations when you're being abused or having other things that are there. You absolutely can't. And so I don't want to minimize that and say this is a garden variety solution. This is more for those day-to-day infractions that are not something that are need or criminal actions where people need to be arrested and everything else. So hopefully that answers a bit.
Sure. And so, based on your answer, it seems like you basically changed your perception of the situation. How would you suggest others do the same, whether it be something chronic in their life, like their station in life may not be, full of control, or there's just a stressful moment where they're going into a presentation, or they're dealing with, they're extremely competent, but they're dealing with too many things to actually handle at one time. How would you recommend people as a practice may change their perception to decrease stress?
Yeah, that's once again another good question. And there's different components to just that question alone that you just asked. So one of the things I oftentimes say in the immediate moment is I try to engage, and this is not something that originated with me, but stop, challenge, and choose. I'm really trying to stop myself and figure out and challenge my perception on the external world of what I'm perceiving. And then what am I trying to achieve in terms of the outcome and the response, right? So I'm stopping, I'm challenging my own bias perception of whether or not, if I engage with you, Michael, and I'm like, well, look, Michael's not even looking at me in the eye right now. He must think this is a bunch of baloney that I'm saying right now. All of a sudden I'm making stuff up in my mind. So
Hmm.
I have to stop, I have to challenge my own self-perception and choose. Either I'm going to ask and say, hey, Mike, Michael, what's going on? How are you doing? Or is this resonating with you? Or what's going on in that particular moment? And I'm choosing right in that moment. That may help to some degree. It may or may not. That if I challenge, because there's so many things that are that we make stuff up, MSU, all the time. We always make stuff up about another individual, groups of people, situations, circumstances is one thing. Other thing that I do for stressful situations is that I try to put pen to paper and write down what I'm doing. I try to be and this is one of the things I talk about, the implementation intention for my day of writing out what's my plan, what am I doing? Okay, what's the work? If this happens, then what? If this goes wrong, then what? I try and plan, and I'm trying to stage on that implementation intention. The other thing that I am a big advocate of that I speak about in the book is what I call is pre-mortem planning. And I don't call it pre-mortem planning, but the concept of pre-mortem planning. So for those of you unfamiliar with that terminology, in medicine, we have a group of doctors called pathologists, and they perform autopsies after a person dies to try and figure out, well, why did they die? We've all watched CSI or some of these other shows that are there. Well, all the work that's being done does nothing to help that person who's dead. that they're dead, they're dead, they're dead. So the concept is let's do pre-mortem planning. Let me identify the challenges in my day, the barriers in my day, everything that can go wrong, everything that can go wrong. I'm trying to eat healthfully. I'm trying to plan. I've heard all this wonderful work about the power of nutrition and lifestyle. Now I'm a plan this out. Now let's figure out. The kids are sick. I can't get to the grocery store. I don't have enough money. They ran out here. What's my plan now? As I've identified all of these challenges, what's my solution? Let's solve for this at this point. So those are some wide scale type scenarios as I'm engaging, a person's engaging in their day-to-day interactions, perhaps in their job and in their situation. Once again, it gets to making stuff up that I may say, hey, my boss, my supervisor, they're always on me. They're always at me. There's just like a very toxic environment. And so the question is, okay, what is it that they really want? Is it that they don't like you, or is it because they're getting beat down by their boss and they're kicking the can downstream? I mean, what's going on? And what is it that they really need? Let me find out what their needs are. So as I entered into another administrative role, one of the things I told my administrative partner is, let's figure out what our higher ups, what's important to them is a concept I always took. What's really important to them? Let's make sure we at least give them what they need that gives us a pass with everything else. Now, don't say the doc was out there trying to skirt underneath and not get things done, but I tried to understand what the needs were of my higher ups, of what they would be reporting to make sure I took care of that first and they weren't on me. Now, some of my other colleagues, they're like, I'm a doctor. No, they don't know. I know. I'm gonna do what I do. And they dealt with the repercussions of it. I taking that approach allowed me to be able to flourish and not and have a degree of latitude with that. Now that doesn't work and it's hard unless it's an individual, but that's a lot said to kind of give you a perspective on multi-tiered approach.
So you were just talking about thought patterns impacting stress, and I realize that you're a cardiologist, not a mental health expert. But
That's correct.
to the best of, but you are talking about stress and thought patterns. In your experience, and perhaps if you know any research, what role does mental health play in contributing to perceived stress?
Oh, that's a continuum that's there, right? So we understand that depression, anxiety, those are stressful states. And part of that, you're perceiving your external environment of either saying of despair from depression and that and having a sense in this hormonal cascade that ensues. We're seeing from anxiety of like a fear, which is essentially another synonym of fear of particular circumstances, situations of what may happen in the future, that this is all part and parcel together. And so this mental outlook has been identified in Journal of American College of Cardiology in terms of looking at a positive outlook and putting a positive spin and what that does to future cardiovascular health and events that are there. And that there's power that having a positive outlook in terms of reframing our perspective is helpful. That's not always easy if I have a hormone imbalance. But I think so. This is not to minimize the importance at times of therapy, of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not to minimize the importance of perhaps of medications when appropriate, but this is to bolster the power of the components of selfish and building resiliency that may be able to help decrease this stress response, the anxiety that's triggered and so forth. And once again, it is. And so give you an example of mindset, one practical. So if you were to meet me on a day in, day out basis, I'm more of an introvert than I am an extrovert. I am an extrovert, so to speak, in clinic because that's who I am. I'm Dr. Batiste. I'm not Columbus. When I'm speaking about the power of health, which is my edict of something I have to do, as I described as to the why at the beginning of this, based on my life's experiences, this is not me. This is about wellness. That's so it becomes easy for me. I say all that to say is that when we're engaging in these scenarios like this, and we're engaging, it's a mindset shift. And I never forget when I started giving the talks, I didn't want to give talks up front. I remember kind of going around and looking like, oh, what if I don't say some stuff I want to say, or what if they're critical? I remember at one point, well, I don't want people looking at me. I remember I was in front of a large audience. I remember looking, and in this moment, I caught someone's eye, and they knew I was looking directly at them. And immediately they looked away. Hmm. I said, I'm up giving a talk, but I'm just note to self. I look over the other direction. I look again inside the audience at someone and they catch their eye. They know I'm looking at them. They look down. I said, none of us want to be seen. None of us want to. I was like, just have fun. Just talk. They may not like what you're saying, but you have to make sure you like what you're saying. You have to make sure it makes sense to you. And so what I'm bringing this example up because that's a mindset shift that as I told my son who's graduating, he said, Dad, I have a lot. This is last night conversation. He said, Dad, I have a lot going on. He's liking this girl. So he told me about this young lady. He's graduating. He said that she told her family about him. I know I'm sharing too much, but he's never going to watch this. And you all better not ever say anything about this to my son if
We'll
we're in the
try.
same spot together. And so he said, she told her family all about me and said, and I think she may have kind of made me out to be too good. And what if I don't live up to it? What if this, that, and the other? And I said, son, I said, just imagine them being anyone else. I said, you're stressed, but this is a natural thing. I said, the recognizing how you feel means it's important to you. That's the first thing. That means it matters. If it didn't matter, you would be careless. But because you have this sense of quote unquote stress, we're labeling it, anxiety, anxious, it matters to you. That means you're normal, you're human. That's first. The second thing is recognize that this means this is your body responding and preparing you to deal with things in life. That means your body is working normally. That's a good thing. That means your body's working the way that it should. This is what you want. I said, now the third thing is recognize that you have control. You just need to be who you are. They're going to see who you are, and that's it. And if who you are is just in that moment, I mean, you want to be the best version of yourself. We all have different versions of ourselves now. Don't get it wrong, but you want to be the best version of yourself in that moment. And guess what? If they don't like you, that's on them. If they like you, great. But it does not matter or change the value of who you are as a person. And that's what we have to remember, I believe.
So, given the cyclical nature of mental health or even take it away from mental health, just the inclination of most people's thought patterns to go into a negative space on stress and then on physical health and then physical health having an impact on how we think and then and there's a cyclical nature to this. Where do we begin to break that chain? Where in your experience is the easiest place to get a foothold? Because if someone is down or having negative thoughts, they may not feel like exercising, or the bacon double cheeseburger with fries and some alcohol may seem more appealing than the whole food plant-based alternative.
Yeah.
So in your experience, where have you found the easiest place for people to get a foothold to break that cycle of stress on health and health on stress?
So two components. I'm gonna try and remember my trend of thought and address both. I think one, I'll bring them up both so you know where I'm going. The first one is keystone habits, not a thought that originated with me. And the second one is putting pen to paper. So let's go back to, start with the latter, which is pen to paper. I believe strongly, and this goes back into where I spoke about implementation planning and others, is that I think it's important for us to write down what our goals are, what we're seeking to accomplish, so they're visible and that we see it that's there. What do we want to accomplish? What do we want to do? What are we trying to get out of life? Not 5, 10 years down the road. I mean, but just practically daily. It's like, hey, I want to be able to come on and make sure I'm on time for this presentation today. I want to make sure that all my audio visual works. I want to make sure that that folks aren't coming in, the dog's not barking. Those are some simple things I have kind of down. And so what else is on there for a list, I'm putting pen to paper and how I'm looking to accomplish that. That alleviates a quite a deal of stress. And I actually am able to visualize. Now, here's the key. Whether or not you're looking at something like James Clear wrote in Atomic Habits or others have influenced, there's so many different wonderful books out there in terms of mindset, whether willpower, instinct, of let's start off with something that's easily achievable. So instead of saying, hey, I want to go whole food plant-based and yeah, that bacon double cheeseburger sounds really good, but okay, can I start off with like an improved snack? Or maybe can I have half the burger? Okay, can I have my breakfast to be better? It doesn't have to be all or none. And so starting that process becomes exceptionally important. So I believe planning is a form of a keystone habit. I think, but when we look at keystone habits, those things entail things like, once again, mindfulness, meditation, and people sometimes are turned off by that concept. They say, I'm not religious, I'm not spiritual, I'm not any of that stuff. And so I'll say, well, you know what? Let's focus on breathing. that, hey, you know what, just commit to doing something simple in terms of breathing. Every day, like as you're kind of starting, that's a very simple way to alleviate stress. But here's what I want you to do that's the added value. I want you to get one of these reward calendars. And I want you to put an X on the day that you accomplish just this simple thing. I'm going to take deep breaths for 30 seconds. Don't say if it's, oh, that doesn't mean anything. I'm going to exercise for 5 minutes. I'm going to go for a walk for 1 minute. Put an X on the calendar for whatever it is. And your goal is not to break the chain. You want the whole entire calendar to line up with X's. And then now, as you see this, you're going to see this reward of, I accomplished that. I was able to do that. Now, okay, let me add to that. Maybe I'll see or work on my sleep, or hey, maybe I'm gonna add on components of my nutrition. Hey, I'm gonna go ahead and say, I'm not gonna exercise, but guess what I'll do? I'm gonna park a little bit further away. I'm gonna walk in a little bit further. I'm gonna take the stairs if I don't have arthritic issues or whatever it is to my location, still waiting for the escalator or waiting for the elevator. That you're gonna make these small gains add up to a lot, and using the concept of compounded interest, 1% gain over the sequence of a year is at over a 33% improvement. That's powerful. Doesn't start off as seeming that way, but that's powerful over the course of a lifetime in terms of changes that you can make. And that's really one of the things that I recommend for that for individuals.
So you mentioned the book by James Clear and Atomic Habits, and I'm familiar with that. It's a great book. Are there other resources or books that you recommend people check out if they want to get more into this type of stuff?
Yeah, so I think Willpower Instinct is a great book too as well. By Kelly McGonigal. The Power of Why is a great book. Of course, I speak to this to a fair amount in my upcoming book. So April 30th is the tentative release date for that one there too as well. That we'll start shipping things out. So there's a wealth of resources, and here's the thing: is that many of the books reference other books inside of there. And so from there, that's one of the key, that's the secret. All right. I'm gonna give you a cardiologist tip. Whether or not, so a cardiologist, when we're reviewing journals and articles that we find things that we like, the reference section will have a plethora of resources that led to the authors either composing their research or their review article that we can then tap into and find things additionally. In legitimate books, they're also going to provide not only research, but they're going to provide references to other books that will then kind of feed you into a nice network of things that you can kind of grab hold of. Other book when you're kind of constructing things, and this one may be more for you, Michael, is Who Not Why is one excuse me, Who Not How is another book that I actually do like here recently. That's one that I've my most recently, I won't say read. My wife always corrects me. I listen to my books just because of time. I
Same.
listen to my books, and she's like, "You don't read your books. I read books. You don't read books. You listen to it." But yeah, yeah,
So just what you brought up your book coming out on April 30th. Do you want to give a shout out to your book and where people can
yeah.
get that book?
Absolutely. So right now it is on drbatiste.com. We have not placed it as of yet on Amazon, although it will be on Amazon available. And so that the release date is April 30th. I just spoke with my publisher. We are on track for that. And I'm excited. And hopefully it's Selfish, a Cure for a Stressed Heart, Stress and Broken Heart. And so really diving in a little bit deeper into some of the things I've given you a high level overview today. And really, hopefully, out of that, we then want to create a community like this that can push people forward. I think that these pillars are so exceptionally important. And I'll tell you, like you said at the beginning of the Q&A, you said it's not common for people to talk about these other aspects when we talk about food. So I came out the gates, I'll be honest, once I realized that nutrition was the way to go, I was only hitting people with nutrition. And I was not even walking them through. I actually looked down on people. I shouldn't, that sounds bad, but it's true, who gave allowances for people who are not 100%. I'm like, here's your prescription. This is what you need to do. Let's go. We're going to go hard, right? And what I realized is the fact that there's culture that's involved, there's relationship that's involved, there's more that surrounds that. People spend 80+% of their lives outside the walls of doctors' offices and hospitals, and that there's a community that's so important that it's either going to support them or it's going to impede them. And so as I started looking at this and listening to my patients over the things that they were concerned about and that were impacting them and that were challenges in their health journey, these things just naturally started to come out of me. based on my upbringing, based on the research, based on things I heard, books that I read an eclectic or I listen to an eclectic amount of books. And I felt as if main nutrition books are powerful, but they leave you with like, okay, that's the ivory tower, and I'm down here, and I have no hope for me. And how do I go about doing it? Because it says you should just do it, and everyone's on the high coming away. I'm ready to do it. Well, okay, how do we implement this? What are the other components that are going to increase the likelihood that I'm going to be successful? And that was really the birthplace of like selfish in terms of it, of understanding that these are components. The last thing I'll say with this is another aha moment for me, right? Another aha moment for me. The aha moment for me was the fact that I would always say for some patients, because my billing system is different where I work, I don't get paid based off of the amount of times you come back. It's whether or not I can keep you healthy and start you down the road. And so for some patients, they were coming back and seeing me, and I was like, man, I don't need to see them. This is just more of a conversational. I enjoy the conversation, but and all of a sudden I said, Columbus, you are their community. You're their community. They're coming back like a game of tag. I'm touching home. I'm safe. Now I'm gonna go back out in the world where I don't have that support. You're their community. And so I recognized that was one of the first aha moments about the power of intimacy of relationships and community that's there. And so that's really was the birthplace of selfish and wanting to put out something that was an aggregate and different, but yet different than what's out there as it relates to the core component. It's still nutrition, nutrition, nutrition. It's like location, location, location. Nutrition, nutrition, nutrition is a foundational centerpiece for achieving ideal health, but it is a fallacy to think that it's not supported. That house is not built. The walls, the insulation, the painting, the elevation by the other components of SEL-ish on top of the F.
So you talk about community and support systems, and so it's very challenging now. I think most of us who are I guess not still kids, grew up at a time where at the very maybe we didn't have the most integrated and robust communities, but kids were outside playing with each other before the advent of cell phones, and therefore the neighborhood kids knew each other, therefore the families knew each other, at least the families of the kids, and there was some sense of community. With the breakdown of community, how has that contributed to stress and physical health issues as well?
Yeah, I believe it's a one-to-one ratio. Whether or not we look at the Rossetto effect of how, Italian community, and I reference this in the book, basically they seem to be sheltered from the adverse effects of cardiovascular disease. And this is despite their eating habits, right? So that they seem to be somewhat sheltered because of the power of community and relationships that were there, of generational relationships. But as they start the standard American way of living began to integrate, you start to see that dissipate too as well. So I believe there's a direct one-to-one relationship, a correlation between the breakdown of the community and the occurrence in the of disease. We see it as well that many of our staunch areas, whether or not this was in school systems where people walk, now they commute, rode your bikes, now you don't. You're driven in cars. We see too as well that there took effort in terms of you had places of faith that were there that were central, and there were community places where people would walk to or drive very short distances. Now people, if they still attend, will commute in. And so it's a different dynamic that now we create these barriers through technology for us to form communities. And there's power that's there when used appropriately, right? And because it's the best that we have. So I think one of the things that I try and encourage is how can we go about creating communities in our own environment? How can we bridge the gap and try to improve? And this is not from a person who knows everything, because I'm challenged to do this even with my own family. At times, son's inside texting here, and well, don't text me from your room. I'm right down the hall. Come talk to me or whatever else, and everything. Let's communicate and creating opportunities for us to communicate. Can we be intentional in our efforts to create opportunities to engage with others? And I think that becomes a key importance. And whether or not it's play dates, whether or not it's team sports, whether or not it's activities, whether or not it's finding like-minded approaches, because we have to do something to combat this idea of loneliness. This idea of loneliness has been shown, increasing data tells us a direct correlation of chronic disease. There's direct correlation between community and the improvement of health outcomes, the adherence to healthy eating, the lowering of diabetes. I referenced a number of different studies and different groups who brought up, and they were able to go ahead and really impact this on a positive note.
So I'm not familiar. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. There was a TED talk that was talking about a study. I don't know the exact study, but it's pretty easy to find online. And the TED talk was talking about rats in a cage. And if you left a rat in a cage by itself, and there was water laced with opioids and regular water, the rat by itself would go and drink the opioid water. And then if you put rats in a cage with the same two choices of water, but there were other rats in there and there were activities in there, then all the rats would just drink regular water, right? So it seemed very environmental uh,
Absolutely.
to um, to that extent, how do we begin to break out of this? Based on what you're seeing when people take on all these neurotic behaviors because of this lonely epidemic, and it breaks them down. It brings them down into a path that is so dangerous to their health. And again, it goes back into that cycle.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I was referencing about creating opportunities for community. So, on the health perspective, one of the things that we've tried to do is we've tried to create support groups. And so you think support groups, well, that's because you have like-minded individuals who are going through or you should say, similar experiences who are going through individuals going through similar experiences, and how that relationship, communication, and dialogue is powerful. That's one of the benefits when we talk about stress. We oftentimes think that, well, I just want to zone out and watch TV and go by myself, have a beer, do whatever, drink, smoke, whatever it may be. But studies have shown that you actually lower your stress hormone by when you engage in conversation with someone else. That is, if you take that moment for a trusted individual, that you can lower that wall that you built up in terms of like fear and the allostatic load of things that now all of a sudden you're able to communicate with someone. It lowers your stress. How do we do it? It's a challenge because now we've gotten in ruts. We've gotten into a habit, a vicious cycle of this cue routine reward that we are staying viciously engaged in this paradigm of staying in isolation. And so it's going to take effort, which means it's going to be painful initially. Whenever you change directions, it creates a small amount of stress that you're going to have to put yourself out there, whether or not it's engaging in a group, whether or not it's choosing to make yourself involved. Another example, I was presenting nutrition at the American College of Cardiology National Conference, 75th anniversary this last week. And so I'm there by myself. I didn't have colleagues who were there with me, throngs of individuals, 75, thousands of individuals that were there. One day I was just like, man, I just don't know if I feel like it going out there with everyone. I'm just going to stay here in the hotel until time for my talk. And so I woke up next morning, I was like, nah, you should go. And I went out there and I forced myself. I said, okay, you're going to choose engage. You have to engage everyone, but try and, network with at least one person each session that you go to. And I'll tell you, that was very rewarding as I went through. I told you I'm an introvert. So I physically had to put myself out there and I had very beneficial time by saying, listen, I'm going to network and making myself communicate, handshake, look in the eye, having a conversation about things, trying to infuse nutrition into these interventional cardiologists, whatever it may be. And I'll tell you that was powerful, but that took effort. It took a level of stress. It took a level of planning and saying, I'm going to do this today. And so whether we do it with our kids in terms of play dates or going out something functional with other individuals or groups, I think we have to be intentional and set a plan. And that is one of the things I talk about is how do we go about achieving this? What's our approach towards having more intimate relationships, social connections, and so forth? But it's going to vary for everyone, and it won't be just plain simple easy. It will take effort.
So now, when people think of a cardiologist and going to the cardiologist, they think of going in, getting some tests, and then being given drugs for any symptoms they may have. How do your patients, that's the first question, and then second question, how do your colleagues respond to your message of how to regain their health that doesn't seem to be pharmaceutically based or pharmaceutically centered, I should say?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, at this point now, after years of doing it, I mean, I've really been doing this almost coming up on 15 years soon, in terms of being engaged in aggressively lifestyle. My colleagues are used to me. But when it first started off, it was just like, oh, okay, what's he talking about? Okay, whatever. And I'll be honest, like the first time I went down this road, I didn't have any elevator pitch. I started, it was just starting. All I did was recommend a few books. And so I had saw three patients back to back to back, who had bad disease. And my colleagues just said, hey, Columbus, would you see them? And you may need to do intervention on them and so forth. And I gave them the books. I didn't have any pitch. I was like, you know what, you should consider doing this. Each patient came back with markedly improved symptoms. I remember never forget my colleague who was the chief of cardiology at that time and hired me was like, man, Columbus, there must be something to the stuff you're saying. I don't know, but I guess there's something to it. And so the results become important and there's growing evidence. And so I began lecturing to them for that. But in terms of what patients perceive, I'm as opposed to other practices where it's solely wellness and lifestyle and people seek out the doctors because they know they're like, I need to go to this doctor because they're going to give me lifestyle. That wasn't my scenario. I was foraging for patients. I would say fishing, but I try not to say that anymore. For to get those who would be able to get engaged inside of the healthy lifestyle. So every patient was like a quick elevator pitch, a TED talk of me trying to get them on board what they wanted and trying to formulate things. And I struck out a lot of times. But the successes, the home runs I hit, it's like a golfer. I don't golf anymore, but I play golf a little bit, too busy for it. But you get that one stroke, it's addictive. You want to go back for more. That's what kept me going. Whenever I'd hear words of affirmation, the power of our words, it's so exceptionally important. But I still prescribe pills, I still do procedures because I tell individuals, it's your choice. My job is to present to you options. I want you to understand, are you going to take the red pill or the blue pill? All right. And so that's a matrix reference for those of you out there if you haven't seen that.
Mhm.
But so the goal is we want to improve these markers of disease. We can do it through lifestyle or we can do it through medications and pills. The lifestyle has almost no risks associated except that you'll probably lose weight. That means you'll have to go out shopping, which means you're going to spend money and you may not want to do that, right? You're going to have improved energy. That means you're going to work more. You're going to love your family more. That's the side effect from this. You take the pills, there's a boatload of side effects you'll have to read on. Procedures, there's risks that are there. It may require in some patients a combination of both, but it's you after I pitch it to you, you have to decide which one you want. But we have to do something. And so oftentimes I'll put patients on an initial dose and say, if you're engaging, we're going to get you off these medications. Let's get you off these. That goal is to get you off these medications as you ramp up on your lifestyle. We're going to ramp down and hopefully eliminate some of the medications. If your lifestyle's down here, the medications go up and it's your choice because I deal with adults, which means my sentiment to every patient is I work for you. You are the CEO of your corporation, which is your body. My job is to advise you, but you're the president and CEO. You make the ultimate decision, and how your decision to proceed is in basis on how much I connect with you in terms of conveying the importance of this.
And after patients adopt some of these things and potentially see good results, what's the follow-up a year out, 2 years out? Do they stay? Are you doing? Presumably, you may have some people who are 15 years out. What percentage of people actually who see these positive results actually stick with it, or do they feel like the reward for getting their health back is to go back to their old behavior?
A mixture of both, to be honest with you. I've had some who are fully engaged and they've made such phenomenal transformations that it's mind blowing. I've had some where I never actually saw them. I didn't learn about it until afterwards. Because I started putting on lectures, called The Missing Link. And I started transitioning, developing cooking classes I did voluntarily after hours before the pandemic called the Cath Lab, which is where I take patients to do procedures. But this was called the cooking alternative to health, and we would demonstrate the power of it with the dietitian I brought on. So I would occasionally get patients who attended those, but weren't my personal patients. And I would see, and they said, Doc, I've been on this now for several years. I dropped weight. I'm off these meds. I'm feeling great. Thank you so much. And I tell them, don't thank me, thank yourself. I didn't do anything. You had to do all the work. I just planted the seed for you. And so I've seen that. I've also seen individuals where they're like, Doc, I should have listened to you. I should have listened to you. and or patients where it's like, yeah, I started and I slipped up and then they're starting to have symptoms again. I know where I need to go and what I need to do and so forth. So I've seen the spectrum. And once again, I think seeing that spectrum over my career is one of the reasons why I've recognized why food alone in isolation is not the sole answer. It has to be supported by a support system that's there to increase the odds, that is, of success.
And is it the support system that made the difference between those that seemed to stick with it and were successful and those that struggled with it or maybe have stopped altogether? Or are there other things maybe in complement to a support system that also contributed to whether someone succeeded or failed?
Yeah, I think so. What I meant by support system, I meant the components of selfish. So, I mean, support system, yes, the community is extremely important. The mindset becomes important. But, if we get practical with things, because one of the things I tried to do was we speak a lot of times about the affordability of lifestyle. And there's been numerous studies that have come out kind of identifying the fact that, yes, indeed, you can eat healthfully in affordable fashion. And I tell patients that the more you go towards a processed or refined or quick and easy approach, the more expensive it is. Eating out, processed foods that are plant and sourced are going to be higher, but when you're having whole foods, those tend to be less expensive. But the point of it is that so when I did cooking classes called No Cooking class and identified individuals, I recognized that there were barriers inside the community for individuals, that their work was not conducive, that they were having to work the night shift, so their sleeping was thrown off and it was hard for them and they had to make ends meet. The fact of pressure of kids of that they couldn't make appointments and various things. And so I was an early adopter before the pandemic in my organization of doing virtual examinations. We would even use avenues where we can examine a person's heart and lungs and do video visits before this was even a thing, because I recognized it was so challenging for people to come into the office sometimes, and even the copay. Um, so, in other words, the community that a person lives in can play as equal potent a role in their health outcomes and in their adherence to a healthy lifestyle as anything else. I understand the impact of air and pollution on the endothelium and triggering the stress hormones. I understand the impact of the noise if you live close to highways or an airport that can trigger the stress hormone cascade and impact the endothelium. So I understand there's so multiple components, and I don't have the power or tools to be able to solve everything for everyone, but to bring to their recognition that here are some areas of barrier. And so, can you get away on the weekends? Can you do certain things of putting earplugs in and so forth? What can we do slowly to kind of improve your state of health overall and make it sustained? Because we understand, once again, going back to the sleep impairment, that when you don't get sleep, it's almost like being inebriated. Your alcohol levels are comparable, which means your judgment gets thrown off. That means that as you're making a decision about what you're going to choose, we all know it. We get the munchies late at night. We're more inclined to have bad food late at night the later we stay up. That's there. And so it's so multifactorial in terms of what ends up playing a role in the success of health outcomes than just solely saying, eat real food, eat whole food, eat plant-rich food. I'm out. That doesn't work. It doesn't work for the average patient I've taken care of. Even if I do a retreat and they walk away out my retreat, they're going back to their environment they were in. I have to give them the tools that can increase the odds that can they be 5% better, 15%, 20%, 15% better than what they were before in an environment that may not be supportive for them? And can we create an ancillary or an adjunct environment that they can touch home, touch base, I'm safe, and then go back over to it? So
So one of our participants is asking if your book is going to be available in ebook form or audio.
yes, yes, and yes. So the audio is, it won't be available on audio at the immediate release, but we will be taping the audio version of the book in May. So I'm hopeful by summer that the audio book will be released on whichever platform, if it's Audible or Apple Books and so forth.
Great.
Ebook as well. We're looking at that.
And you may be familiar with Dr. Williams and his work, and he is fond of saying that one of his major goals is to make heart disease no longer the number one killer of cardiologists. How have you found your message resonating with your colleagues in cardiology? Are they seeing your results and starting to do it for themselves? Are they sharing it with their patients? What are you
Yeah.
seeing?
Yeah, so I'm seeing engagement and interest. I'm even seeing some who've adopted it. I had a colleague who's, she said, hey, she's exceptionally smart individual. She's like, hey, I'm doing it. My levels were high, cholesterol, and I'm doing your thing. I was like, well, it's not my thing, but I mean, I'll take that. I've had other colleagues who tried it, and I remember one colleague telling me, another interventional cardiologist, he said, man, Columbus, I know this is probably just in my head, but I feel like a level of clarity that's there now since I started doing this. And I was like, yeah, it is in your head and it is real. And as we kind of went through, and oftentimes what they'll do is they will refer them to me. They'll either ask me to go and talk to their patients. They'll give me some of the handouts that I provide to patients that's there. But, it's what one thing we have to realize, and what I would add to Dr. Williams' response is cardiologists are just like everyone else. The absence and lack of nutritional training means that they are not an expert in nutrition because they have not dedicated themselves to reviewing the literature in depth. And as a result, they're going to be beholden to every single thing that everyone else is. And that's what the studies have demonstrated, that stressful periods increase the rates of fast food and ultra processed food consumption in healthcare providers, including physicians and nurses, that we see that's there, that we're seeing that all these same perilous impacts are still happening on a regular basis. And so I don't look at them as this is their area of expertise and they should know better. I'm looking at them like they're going to be resistant like every other patient walking into my door because this is their culture, their family, cookbooks that have been passed on generationally, and they think it's okay to have a burger stand outside of a cardiovascular institute, that they think it's okay to have a potluck that's filled with foods that are ready to harm and kill them. And so I have to do it with love, and love takes action. Love is not passive. But love means that I'm respectful, I'm showing empathy, and I'm trying to tease them towards a state of well-being and understanding to implement change that will mount. Because if we can change them and they become believers and advocates, all of a sudden, we've seen this in every instance, whether or not it's mammogram screening, whether or not it's colonoscopy screening, if the doctor is not a believer in it, he will not convey it to his patients. If I can make my cardiologists, my clinicians to feel like there is power in lifestyle, I may not do as I say, not as I do. I'm still winning because I'm getting them to tell the importance to patients. So long-winded answer as I've been doing the whole entire time, but I think it's just important to kind of understand.
So we've got 1 minute left. I'm going to throw in two quick questions,
All right.
or you're going to ask the quick questions, but I'm going to ask for quick
Good.
answers. Okay, so in Selfish, you mentioned specific lifestyle changes for heart disease prevention. What is the most significant change that someone can make without going into too much detail? And then the last thing is, what gives you hope with the work that you're doing and what you're seeing in response?
Yeah, I'll say the single most powerful change that person can make is, I will say, is still nutrition. Is the most, because I think it impacts the entire scope that's there, and that we can, from a culture, be able to apply it to whatever our cultural eating pattern is. So that's that one. I think the second scenario, as it relates to what gives me hope, I'll tell you, events like this, the fact that there is a receptiveness for hearing about it, there is this hunger, this thirst, that there is something that we are not providing in healthcare that needs to be provided, and that communities at large are really demanding it. That we're saying we want to be healthy, that we should not, this should be life, liberty, and the pursuit of health, that we should all be able to pursue health, a healthy lifestyle, a healthy well-being that gives us vitality and we can live a life of purpose. So it gives me hope. It gives me hope when I hear one word of affirmation. I'm not looking for a throng of 1,000 people, but every time I get someone saying, I appreciate the work you're doing, I appreciate the message, I appreciate the conference you put on, I appreciate this, it means more than you think. They're not just like glossy words. It actually does. I actually take it to heart. Now, I'll be honest, and I'm gonna stop here. I do ignore the negative stuff because I don't read it. Most people are never going to come up and say something negative to me. And I don't read any subsequent posts if I put something out there on social media, just so I'm not reading anything negative because I don't need to have that in my head. That's not what this is for. Once again, just like giving a talk, do I feel it resonates? Is it something that would help me? I'm putting it out there into space.
Great, and it's a good strategy. So, with that, I'd like to thank you, Dr. Batiste. It was a great presentation, a lot of really wonderful information shared. If we could unmute the audience so they can share their appreciation for the doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Batiste.
Appreciate it.
Doc, thank you so much for your help, your information.